If you strip away the romantic imagery of horned helmets and wild raids, what remains is a society obsessed with control, awareness, and survival. Vikings did not rely on brute force alone. Their world was hostile, politically unstable, and geographically exposed, and this forced them to develop layered security systems that were practical, adaptive, and surprisingly sophisticated. For anyone studying early medieval Europe, especially through the lens of survival and conflict, Viking security thinking deserves serious attention. Viking settlements were designed as early warning systems rather than passive villages. Viking towns and farmsteads were rarely placed at random. Settlements clustered along waterways, not just for trade, but for surveillance. Rivers and fjords acted as controlled access routes, narrowing the approach of enemies and providing long sight lines. Elevated ground near shorelines allowed watchmen to detect unfamiliar sails hours before arrival. This was not accidental geography. It was intentional defensive planning. In practical terms, this meant that a Viking community rarely faced surprise attacks without warning. Smoke signals, horn blasts, and runners relayed information quickly across short distances. A modern survivalist studying this system would recognize the principle immediately. Control the approach, limit blind spots, and build communication into the landscape itself rather than relying on last-minute reactions. Longhouses functioned as defensive structures, not just communal homes. The Viking longhouse was more than a living space. Its design prioritized security. Thick timber walls, often reinforced with turf or stone, provided insulation and resistance against fire and weapons. Entrances were narrow and few, forcing attackers into predictable choke points. Interior layouts allowed defenders to retreat inward while maintaining control of the doorway. This matters because it shows a defensive mindset built into daily life. Vikings did not separate domestic and military architecture. A family home doubled as a last resort stronghold. Applied today, the lesson is clear: secure structures should serve everyday purposes while retaining defensive advantages, not exist as isolated fortifications that draw attention. Natural barriers were deliberately amplified to reduce manpower needs. Viking defences leaned heavily on terrain. Marshlands, dense forests, cliffs and water were not obstacles to be overcome, but tools to be exploited. Earthworks and ditches were often dug to connect natural features, creating defensive rings that required minimal maintenance and fewer guards. This efficiency is critical. Vikings understood that manpower was limited, especially outside raiding season. By shaping the environment, they reduced the need for constant patrols. For historians, this reframes Viking intelligence as logistical rather than purely martial. For survivalists, it reinforces the value of passive defences that work continuously without human presence. Harbour security relied on control rather than walls. Unlike later medieval ports, Viking harbours were rarely ringed with stone walls. Instead, they relied on controlled access. Narrow channels, submerged obstacles, and shallow approaches restricted large enemy vessels. Familiarity with tides and currents gave locals an advantage over outsiders. Ships could be pulled ashore quickly, denying attackers naval superiority. This system favoured flexibility over permanence. It allowed Vikings to shift between trade and defence without rebuilding infrastructure. In modern terms, this is adaptive security, systems that can change function instantly depending on threat level. Social intelligence networks were as important as physical defences. Viking security extended beyond wood and earth. Information was currency. Travellers, traders and emissaries were sources of intelligence. News of rival movements, political shifts or brewing conflicts travelled fast along Viking routes. Hospitality was strategic. Guests were questioned, observed and remembered. This human intelligence network reduced uncertainty. Attacks were often anticipated weeks in advance. Applied today, the principle remains unchanged. Situational awareness is strongest when built through relationships and information exchange rather than isolated monitoring systems. Law and reputation functioned as deterrents against internal threats. Security was not only about external enemies. Internal conflict could be just as dangerous. Viking legal systems, assemblies and public dispute resolution reduced the likelihood of feuds escalating into destabilizing violence. Reputation mattered deeply. A known oathbreaker or aggressor faced social isolation, which in a survival-based society was often a death sentence. This social enforcement reduced the need for constant armed oversight. Stability was maintained through shared norms rather than coercion. For modern readers, this demonstrates how strong community standards can serve as a powerful, low-cost security mechanism. Raiding strategy was built on intelligence gathering and timing, not chaos. Viking raids actually succeeded because they were planned. Scouts would assess targets, their defences and how quickly people could respond. Raids were launched when defenders were distracted, maybe politically divided, or, just seasonally vulnerable. This was strategic exploitation, not random violence. Understanding this really reshapes how we interpret Viking aggression. Their success was, honestly, rooted in preparation and information dominance. Any serious student of warfare or survival strategy will recognize this as a timeless principle: strike only when conditions are controlled. Redundancy ensured survival when primary defences failed. Viking security systems, they were layered. If early warning failed, terrain slowed attackers. If terrain was breached, structures limited access. If structures fell, community response and mobility allowed evacuation or counterattack. No single defence was relied upon exclusively. This redundancy is perhaps the most valuable lesson. Vikings expected failure and planned for it. Modern survival planning often fails by placing too much faith in one system. The Viking approach reminds us that resilience comes from overlapping safeguards. Viking security thinking remains relevant because it prioritizes adaptability. What makes Viking security systems truly impressive is not their materials, but their mindset. Everything was adaptable, multi-purpose, and really rooted in realism. There was no illusion of perfect safety, only preparation for uncertainty. If you study Viking defences closely, you begin to see a blueprint for sustainable security that transcends time. Control access, gather intelligence, shape the environment, build community cohesion, and expect failure and plan beyond it. If this kind of deep practical history is what you come to Warpaths of Europe for, make sure you subscribe, share this with fellow historians and survival-minded viewers, and stay with the channel as we continue uncovering how the past still teaches us how to endure.